Okay, we're talking about worldview and the results of what is ultimate in a worldview, that is God, and then what is reality in a worldview with what exists, the ontology. And the idea is that in non-Christian worldviews, you have a problem because you don't have a true hierarchy of being and of value, which we're going to see in a minute. It's a problem for the most important concepts we think about every day of law and justice and praise and blame, if we can't really put a hierarchy of value on those things, or say that one kind of thing is more important or better than another thing. So here, I gave the examples of pantheism as a worldview or atheistic physicalism as a worldview compared to Christian monotheism. But we think about applying this, for example, as knowledge in a worldview. What counts as knowledge? In epistemology, we think about that word episteme in Greek just means knowledge, just like the word skio or scientia in Latin means knowledge, okay? We get the word science from. But ultimately, the idea of a science or epistemology is, look, how do we have justified true beliefs? Okay, what counts for knowledge? And in the case of knowledge in a worldview, just go to atheistic physicalism. How do you even have knowledge if everything that exists are, again, stardust particles that accidentally clump together and are deterministically bumping into each other to produce effects? I'm not even sure what knowledge is in that kind of a worldview. Same thing with what's personhood. What's a person? That's just a different way that the protons, neutrons, and electrons clump together. Why that's significant, why it's better, what knowledge is, what it means to convey propositions. It's just virtually meaningless in that worldview. Same thing in pantheism. In true, what's called absolute pantheism, there's about 5 different kinds of pantheism, but absolute pantheism says God is all, everything that exists is divine, there's only one thing that exists, but ultimately God is impersonal. So we start thinking about what personhood is. In a pantheistic worldview, again, everything's equal. There really are no persons that exist, so it's hard to put a value on anything. So what's knowledge in that worldview? Again, for example, true knowledge versus false knowledge. What's true versus false beliefs? There's only is. There is no ought. So getting truth and falsehood is virtually impossible in that worldview, which brings you to, well, what's true and false about goodness, okay, morality in a worldview. And so this is where to say something is right or wrong is significant because, again, protons, neutrons, and electrons in a stardust blender don't produce oughts. There's only a physical is. Pantheism, if everything is divine and non-personal and spirit, how do you know how you have an ought? How do you encourage someone to do something or be better if they are already divine? See, if pantheism is true, everybody needs to look in the mirror and start singing how great thou art, okay? Because you're already divine. You got that? And this is why it's real easy to do apologetics in these areas, because you just show that people can't live consistently with the worldview that they proclaim. Nobody lives consistently with an atheistic, physicalistic worldview. Fact is, they have to use words like should and ought. Pantheists talk about should and ought, how they can be better, or the existence of evil, or they worship an object when they say only one thing exists. So they have to constantly borrow from a Christian worldview, which again results in, again, what's morality for human beings? Again, what's a human being in pantheism and atheistic physicalism? Again, atheism, you've got a human being, it's just a different way that the particles clump together. It's no better, and it's just different, very important, different, not better or worse than a tree, a rock, or a lump of something, okay? Same thing with pantheism, everything's different. There's one big is. But with monotheism, what you have is an eternal, perfect, good, loving, holy being, okay, who creates the universe as a limited, changeable, or mutable thing. You've got different things that exist. Yes, you've got protons, neutrons, and electrons that can make human bodies and trees and animals and, oxygen and things like that. But more importantly, God makes human spirits or souls, which is the ground for our freedom, for our morality, for those higher things of, what constitutes enjoyment, aesthetics, what's beauty, the higher things that make us in the image of God. So again, the idea of being a self-aware person and why that's meaningful, well, we're starting with a perfect being who is also a personal being. So we can talk about what the most valuable kinds of things are. So we start with, well, what are persons? And what are the persons that are most like the most perfect persons? Okay, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. So we can go up that hierarchy of being and value in the analysis, starting with perfect being theology. What's morality? Again, God is unchangeably holy. He's righteous. He's just. He's all these things. And he can, and as a holy being, he can only design the world to be holy and to function well and to have joy and satisfaction and holiness and goodness. God in his immutable holiness is not going to make something that's defective in that way. It wouldn't be consistent with the character of God, who's immutably holy and good. So he makes human beings, and this is important. God didn't have to make anything at all, but he makes little persons that are changeable, limited, mutable, contingent, non-necessary things that are similar to God in arguably every way they can be and still be created. For what purpose? To enjoy, that our joy is made full in satisfaction of enjoying beauty and love and righteousness in relationship with other persons. See, this is the highest good, which, by the way, it's not hard to demonstrate that every single person in the world is seeking to be loved, okay? To love others, to be in these meaningful, loving relationships. They want to be right in who they are and what they do. So it's really easy to get into to proof of these moral objectivism. Well, yeah, people do recognize there's these universal moral rules or laws grounded in the creation, that people want to be righteous. They want to be loved. You get past all the veneer, and this is what people are really aspiring to. Why? Because they recognize a Christian worldview as being true, but they're cloaking it with these other falsehoods. So we end up with, again, the ultimate in life that people actually want is to mirror the intertrinitarian fellowship and blessedness, the happiness that comes from these things. The problem, though, is that people sin. It's how they deal with their sin problem. They either, and by the way, this is important, everybody knows there's a sin problem. Every person who exists acknowledges there's a sin problem. But there's two ways that the false religions and philosophies deal with it. Only two ways. There's lots of ways it fleshes out. One way is to pretend there is no law. See, atheism and moral skepticism says there is no law. If there's no law, then I can't be guilty of anything. Okay? So you've got entire systems built to prove that there is no law. Well, the problem is that you can't get away from the guilt and the fear of death and everything else. So these don't work either. And then there's the false religions that are not God's religion, which teach you this. Yes, there is guilt, and there is a universal moral law, and we know we violated it. But the way to fix it is to do enough good works to make up for my bad works. Okay? That's all the cult of Christianity, heresies, and world religions. Okay? It's always works righteousness. It's not salvation by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone, for the sake of forgiveness and personal reconciliation, to have an ongoing walk with God, the reconciliation of broken fellowship that we had in the past. So this is why, so when we think about this hierarchy of good, better, and best, by having this perfect being, transcendent theology of God who makes the world, and again, even though we're limited and contingent and mutable, we can measure right and wrong in a hierarchy. I know I should save the human baby instead of the dog because a human baby is more like God than the seeing eye dog, okay, in essence. That's a just slam dunk, easy choice to make. And the fact is, we do recognize this because it's representative of reality. But here's something that is very important. We start thinking about praise and blame, reward and punishment. These are the big issues that the entire human race focuses on all the time. So think about this. When you commit a crime, how do you measure the penalty? Well, you think about it is, well, what was the harm that was done? Now think about this, okay? And this is why we know that everybody intuitively recognizes that there is a hierarchy of being and value. Because think about the same external act, okay, committed against different type of things. So let's say you've got your proverbial, 10-pound sledgehammer and your altar, and now you start with, right, what's the lowest possible thing you can imagine in being and value? And the first thing that comes to mind is what? Lawyers, right? Okay. And I can say that because, I'm a lawyer. So, but okay, how about a dirt clod? Boom, smash that dirt clod. Any sympathy? No. Okay, now a cockroach. Boom, you're like, all right, God needs cockroaches, but just not in my house, okay? In fact, you could probably commit a cockroach holocaust in your house and there's going to be no sympathy, okay? Now, but see, a cockroach is a greater kind of thing than a dirt clod because at least it's alive. So you look at the characteristics of God is life. So something that's not alive versus something is alive, say the live thing is going to be greater than the not alive thing, okay, as its inherent value and quality. Now you go up the scale, and you can keep going doing this. And if I had more time in class, we do the dog and cat wars in theology. But see, now you put the cat on the altar, right? And you got your 10-pound sledge. And now you're ready. Let's go, boom. Okay, you're going. Now cat people are going, well, that's awful. The dog people are going, so, okay, okay. You got, I know, never mind. We'll put the laugh track in later. But point is, most of you are going, ooh, why would someone do that to a cat? Now put your golden retriever puppy on there, right? Do the same thing. Oh, so how come you did not have that reaction to the cockroach getting hit? Because you again, you intrinsically recognize that a dog or a cat is a type of person. I'll get into that later. Not a morally responsible person, but a self-aware being that has feelings and so on and so forth. And that's greater than a cockroach. So when you snuff out the life of a dog or a cat, that's a greater harm that's done, and hence you'd have a greater penalty for it. Hence, that's why we have laws, and we should, against cruelty to animals, but not cruelty against cockroaches, right? So now we go up the scale, go all the way up to human beings, and we look at the value. You put a human being on that altar, and you intentionally take the life of another human being with premeditation, malice aforethought, without mitigation, justification, or excuse. You have just taken a debt that is the value-wise of someone in the image of God. And the only way you could ever pay for that is to do what? Give something that's the value of the image of God to satisfy the scales of justice, which is what? Genesis 9:6. If you shed man's blood, by man your blood will be shed because he's in the image of God. That's the substantive proportional basis for capital punishment. You see, if you do in fact incur the debt of a human life in the image of God and you owe it, the only thing you can do to truly satisfy it, for pure justice to be done, is give your own life. Okay. Now, of course, when we do justice, there's procedural justice, there are mitigating factors in sentencing, there's all sorts of things that need to be taken into consideration. Even the very fact that with the first murder of Cain and Abel, God didn't give Cain the death penalty right away. He actually let him live. There were mitigating circumstances. But that's for an ethical discussion about capital punishment. But again, you go up the value that needs to be satisfied. If you shed man's blood, by man your blood will be shed. Finally, and we'll end with this, it's important we have this hierarchy of value, because now we start thinking about things like, what happens if you sin against God? The most valuable, an eternal, infinite being of the greatest holiness and greatest quality. Now, the answer of Anselm of Canterbury in the 11th century, the Protestant scholastics, is going to be this. Because the quality of the being increases, the greater the harm is when you commit a sin against it. Okay? So sinning against God now, the answer is, well, now you've incurred an infinite debt because of the quality of the being involved. And so because of that, two problems. How does anybody pay an infinite debt? And the answer is you can't. And we'll get to this later, but one, you can't pay the infinite debt because, frankly, your job is to be holy all the time, and you simply cannot accrue merit to start paying off an infinite debt. That's one of the reasons it never gets paid. But the other is that you can't add one piece of merit or increment of merit to the next to ever get to an actual infinite, qualitatively or quantitatively, amount of merit. Why? Because you're a limited person doing limited works that have a limited quality to them. So because of that, what do you have? You're under an infinite penalty, okay, which results in you moment by moment being separated from God in your temporal punishment. So the question becomes, well then, who can save us? And we end with now the necessity of a God-man for salvation. Who can, since God must be just, and more on that later, God can't ignore injustice. God can't ignore sin because that would be like God ignoring people torturing babies for fun. He has to do justice. He has to give what's owed. But since the offense is against him, he can actually do the justice, bear the harm, and not hold it against us. So what you have now, who can pay an infinite debt or do an infinite amount of merit? And the answer is there's only one infinite being, and that's the God of the Bible. So the God of the Bible has to do a work that produces infinite merit to pay for sin. So what's the wages of sin? Death, spiritual and physical death. Yeah, but God can't die as gods, but it has to be a work of infinite merit. Hence, what do we get? Christmas. Get the incarnation. We need a God-man, one who can do a work of infinite merit, but actually die, spiritually and physically. Hence, you need someone with two natures, a fully divine nature and a fully human nature. And then because of that, what Christ does in his active obedience, lives a perfect life of obedience, and then dies for us in our place, he actually makes a, quote, infinite satisfaction, which we'll qualify later. And now that's an atonement or satisfaction that is sufficient to pay for every sin. At that point, it's done. It is finished. The only thing left to do is, do you want it? Repent and believe. So this is why that hierarchy of being is so important. It goes into also answering questions like, what's the necessity of the incarnation and why the necessity of Christ to die for sin? Because we actually need someone who can pay an infinite debt. So anyway, more on that next time. But next we'll move to definitions of theology next time we meet. Thanks.